after a territory-wide national trust was established in 1976, there were tensions between its top end and Central Australian members, with the latter, that is the Central Australians, often quick to remind others that the organisation was founded in Alice Springs. Well, I think it's probably fairly clear from what I've been saying so far that Central Australia in the 1950s, the period that I've been talking about, was what we'd probably best describe as a transitional place. It was sitting between a period of trauma that immediately followed the Second World War and a period of global social reconfiguration that really started to get going in the 1960s. The past in Central Australia in the 1950s was still very close. Aboriginal people, assumed by most Australians to be comparatively recent arrivals to the continent, still retained many elements of their pre-contact lifestyle. And we know, of course, that there were some Aboriginal people living in Central Australia in the 50s who'd had virtually no contact with white people at all, in some cases none whatsoever. Permanent non-Indigenous occupation was not yet a century old. For much of non-Indigenous Australian society in the 1950s, this near past was interesting but peripheral to the concerns of everyday life. In Central Australia, however, it was very close to everyday life. Doreen and many other Central Australians often contended that their region, this part of Australia, was set apart from the rest of the nation and therefore worthy of protection. Buildings, objects and landscapes became endowed with various meanings constructed by reference to both this perceived uniqueness of Central Australia within the national frame and also to some very local notions of history and very local notions of heritage significance. It was, of course, and inevitably, a perspective that reflected the times. The views of Aboriginal people, of Indigenous custodians, were generally considered unimportant, and local Aboriginal opinions of the significance of cultural places, objects and art were usually not sought. In terms of what today we regard as Indigenous heritage, this vision amounted to an appropriation of components that appealed to the white Australian and international community. Things like rock art and the traditional portable objects like, spears and wimmers and all those kinds of things that continued to be manufactured by the descendants of the first Australians. A strong preservation consciousness, provided the underlay for the significance ascribed to these components of Aboriginal heritage, heightened, no doubt, by the widespread belief that Aboriginal society was threatened by the inexorable advance of what was regarded as civilisation. For settler heritage, as people like Doreen and her friends would have understood it, the vision focused on the notion of Central Australia as a frontier, which with the impact of modern technology was being tamed, but it was a frontier nonetheless. For most members of the non-Indigenous community, the management of heritage amounted to a representation of triumph over adversity. This heritage formed the backdrop for written and remembered historical narratives that reinforced a sense of belonging. With the benefit of hindsight, and hindsight is often all too easy, it can be argued that the notion of a cultural heritage for Central Australia was developed in the 1950s along Eurocentric and parochial lines. But I do want to finish on a more positive note because I think there were other significant factors. In particular, it was during the 1950s that Central Australians helped set the foundations for the growth of a wider, more inclusive Australian heritage consciousness that developed in later years. Many of the Central Australian places and objects that were considered to be significant in the 1950s have taken on new and often very special meanings today. They've taken on new meanings in shifting social contexts. It was during the 1950s that the concept of managing Central Australia's cultural heritage for future generations first took form. And when we talk about future generations here in Central Australia, they saw the local heritage as being something important, not just for themselves, but important for the rest of Australia. And it's on that point that I wish to finish.